and inequality. So commodity-based economies, they tend to be boom and bust depending on global cycles, and we've seen that a lot recently. Whether we like to acknowledge it or not, we were really hit by the downturn because we're dependent largely, over half of our exports are still minerals-based. And I suspect Nigeria has had similar problems, although the oil price has different dynamics. But the fact is that if you look at manufacturing value add in South Africa, it's only 10% of our GDP. In Nigeria, according to the media, it's now about 6%. But I do think an advantage we have is both our commodity base is more diversified and our manufacturing is more diversified. And that's reflected in our trade relations, where we're exporting manufacturers to Nigeria and importing petroleum, basically. And what I do think should be a concern for both countries is that our trade is relatively small. So Nigeria accounts for only 1% of our exports, although a much bigger share of our manufactured exports, and it's 5% of our imports, but it's virtually entirely petroleum. And I think the challenge is to say, how do we come up with a more balanced trade relationship where we actually have a trade relationship that supports more advanced value-adding industries in both countries? So it's fine for South Africa to say we're exporting manufacturers, but it's not a major partner and we need major partners. And it's fine for Nigeria to say, but it's a bigger share of our imports, but it's all petroleum. And that's not going to generate a lot of jobs. And then the other thing I just want to flag is the issue about inequalities and governance challenges, that it is classic for commodity-based economies to have deeper inequalities, and that leads to all sorts of policy conflicts and governance challenges that I think we have in common. And that's another reason we have to work together to say, I think we can learn from each other to say, how do you develop a more equitable economy when you're basically a mining-based economy? And how do we think about that? And how can we work together using even some of the EU mechanisms to try and help each other strengthen governance, given this huge challenge, which is divided societies that are divided economically tend to have very contested and difficulty in ensuring policy stability.
I'm going to call on Professor Charles Okealam, who has joined us, and he is going to talk about capital markets in Africa. He was born in London, but he holds a dual Nigerian and British citizenship, and he co-founded an investment firm, AGH Capital Group, in 2002, and was professor of banking and finance, University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, and has made several contributions to the study of banking and finance, many of which were first of their kind on the continent in the area of application of econometric methods to industrial organization in financial institutions and financial systems, tests of market efficiency, integration, and the role of institutions and governance, and financial sector regulation and policy. Has received a number of awards, including being awarded the higher doctorate in financial economics from the University of Exeter in the UK. Professor Okealam, please come forward.
The difference between Nigeria and South Africa, the differences are often overplayed. And they are overplayed and they're presented in the wrong meme. So when I read this document, I read about threats and I read about the sense of unease that some South African friends of mine might have about Nigeria. Yes, Nigeria's economy is 510 billion US dollars. Some of us think that it's really about 543, and they're still looking at the numbers. South Africa is about 360 billion. GDP per capita, South Africa, much more significant than that in Nigeria, almost double. But if you look at the underlying growth, you look at that 510 billion, if you think that Nigeria's GDP ostensibly in 1994, at the same time 20 years ago, was 3 billion, or 24 billion, and the market capitalization was 3 billion of the stock market. At the same time, at that time, South Africa's market cap, I believe, at that time was in the order of 225 billion. Now it's sitting at about 500 billion. Nigeria's is 90 billion. So these numbers I'm throwing out now show differences. If you look at this, Nigeria's GDP is bigger, population is bigger, having gone from 110 million in 1994 to about 170 million now. South Africa is having gone from about 38 million in 1994 to about 51 or so million now. So these statistics, I don't think we should worry about the GDP size. There's some political issues there about who will be in the G20, about who will make the biggest noise. But, we could make all kind of crude jokes, with their ladies here, what does size mean, and does it matter, and the issue here really is more fundamental. The question that I'd like to talk about is how Nigeria and South Africa can work together, and without the jingoism that goes with this. And how can we work together? And what does it mean for our markets? Well, South Africa's capital market is bigger than Nigeria's. Nigeria's GDP is bigger. South Africa's infrastructure stock is higher than Nigeria's, and Nigeria's per capita is even higher than that. So the issue there is, to what extent can both countries learn from each other? And what have they got to do with the greater agenda of developing the continent as a whole? There are structural problems in both economies. If you look at South Africa, I can identify 3 structural problems: the presence of oligopolies and the absence of true competition in a number of sectors, an inappropriate monetary policy for its level of economic development, and problems with the flexibility of the labor market. Those are probably well discussed. And in Nigeria, the main challenge in Nigeria is the issue of inflation, of pass-through and transfer of proper prices. The major problem, next problem, there is the issue of infrastructure, which is the real drag on the Nigerian economy. And of course, the bugbear is the absence of transparency between the various levels of government, and the absence of due process, and therefore the level of graft that exists within the system. And that's a euphemism when I say graft, the level of corruption that still is evident in the system. So both countries have a lot to offer each other. That's the first story. Both countries have different growth trajectories. Both countries have different strengths. Both countries have different weaknesses. The issue is, will Nigeria and South Africa be able to complement each other and work well? Positioning the discourse from the context of threat is to misrepresent what the real challenge is. As I've written in a number of places and argued in a number of other places, this is exactly what a number of people would want Nigeria and South Africa to do, to have a position where there is a perception of lack of trust. Nigeria is not going anywhere, whether or not South Africa wants it to go anywhere. South Africa is not going anywhere, whether or not Nigeria wants it to go anywhere. So Nigeria and South Africa have to cooperate. When you go to the AU, I'm a member of something called the African Union, Trustees of the African Union Foundation, which is chaired by Assistant Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. When you sit there, you see, and you go to AU, you see the role that Nigeria and South Africa have to play on the continent and continue to play. It's one of cooperation. I've sat on the boards of, I think, 4 major South African institutions: South African Airways, where I was a board member, Sun International, Bond Exchange of South Africa, and ABSA Corporate Merchant Bank. And I've sat on the board of Nigerian companies. All companies, all businesses want to do the right thing, keep their costs down, make revenues, win new customers, return profits to shareholders, grow businesses, seek opportunities. In that context, Nigerians are not different from South Africans. South Africans are not different from Nigerians. You try to get on an SAA flight to Nigeria at peak time, at any of the peak times, where you see that there are no seats. That means there's a lot of activity taking place, and that's what we want to champion. And I'm willing to bet that the identification of Nigeria's GDP as 510 billion is going to encourage a lot of international investors to push further and come and work more closely with Nigeria. And that's the argument that I think we would put forward in the context of South Africa. And vice versa, that Nigeria seeks opportunities in South Africa, given that it reveals that the level of the GDP is this high level.
Sylvester is chartered accountant and an MBA graduate of University of Cape Town. He works for EY, and EY has done a lot of work researching the African economy country by country, as well as by region. Now, Chris Becker made certain comments earlier on. Sylvester, if you could speak to some of those elements as well, regarding the growth rates in Nigeria in particular, and saying, as much as we are told on the basis of rebasing that the Nigerian economy is much bigger than South Africa by 60%, the numbers that he's looked at from the company results are indicating a slowdown of sorts in the economy. Please, Sylvester.
We do this research and this survey on the African continent, and maybe I should start and talk about why we do that. We do that to, one, help African countries to be able to make their countries easier to do business and to leverage on their development and to make sustainable development become a reality. The second part, and which really pushed us to do that, was to say, how do we help companies who want to expand further into the African continent to take advantage of this high growth we're talking about? So, last year, 2013, Nigeria, in terms of capital invested, saw the most FDI investment in the continent, followed by South Africa. But in terms of number of projects, South Africa was number one and Nigeria was number two. So what the rebasing has done then for Nigeria is probably to say to people, those 171 million people you thought you could save as consumers actually have a bit more wealth if you take the fact that per capita income is average wealth of the people if it was equally distributed. So it would make Nigeria more attractive for FDI projects. We do know that Nigeria is investing a lot in its infrastructure, ongoing infrastructure projects. It's an economy that's diversifying. But now I think we need to look at that as an opportunity for South Africa and for the rest of the continent. Why is it an opportunity? South Africa is highly developed, highly saturated. The companies in South Africa are a bit more mature. South Africa Inc. Is South Africa Inc. looking at Nigeria? We've mentioned South Africa's manufacturing as an investment destination. We know today that MTN's biggest revenue contributor is the Nigerian operation. It did not start at the same time as MTN South Africa started, but yet it's their biggest operation. Nigeria is still sitting at a very low level of mobile penetration, so there's still a lot of room for growth in Nigeria. And the rebasing has basically said the people are a bit more wealthier than we initially thought. So that's the biggest takeaway of this rebasing now, I think, whether the rebasing is correct or not. Now, when we look at South Africa Inc., how is South Africa Inc. going to benefit from the growth that Nigeria is seeing? The other part is to look at how is Africa Inc. going to benefit. Africa can only benefit as a continent, or the regional integration can really happen within the time frame that was agreed, if all the economies can grow and be at a level where there's a lot of trust and one is seen as being exploited or being used as a consumer base for his other for the other countries. So I think in terms of looking at this rebasing, it's a huge opportunity. The numbers could be discussed and argued, but what needs to be focused on is the opportunity for South African Inc., South African corporate, for Nigeria Inc. So the Nigerians are richer. It means we know that a lot of medical tourists from Nigeria, the biggest tourism spenders as shoppers in South Africa are actually Nigerians, and then the Angolans. So then South Africa then is open to benefit more of this wealthier, on average, Nigerians who come to South Africa as tourists, medical tourists or shopping tourists. So I think it's a win-win that Nigeria is growing much faster and the economy has been rebased to be a much bigger economy than the South African economy.
I'm going to ask an open-ended question here. That as much as we're talking about the two countries, and Professor, earlier on you spoke about whether size matters or not between the two countries. But now we are in the southern tip of the continent. Nigeria is the west of Africa, and there are issues of distance between Nigeria and Europe, South Africa, Europe, US, and so forth. Whether the Africa orientation makes any sense at all in the long run, that wouldn't countries do business with whoever they want to do business with anyway, irrespective of Nigeria being an African country, South Africa being an African country? That is there going to be any special relationship between the two on the basis of, does it make any difference?
For us as Africans, we have to ask ourselves the questions. We are the continent that has the worst indicators of social indicators. we have some of the greatest difficulties when it comes to issues of governance. We have some of the greatest difficulties when it comes to cooperation amongst ourselves. And we are spatially distant, and some of the countries are sparsely populated and some are dense. And if you're in Nigeria and working in Nigeria, in the corporate sector in Nigeria, and I was the chairman of one of the banks in Nigeria, Nigerians are not preoccupied with South Africans. They're not spending their time. The Nigerian corporate sector is not thinking about South Africa. It's thinking about where it can make money in the world. And that's the issue. And I think that the South Africans have to look at Nigeria in the same way. Can they make money in Nigeria? Can they make money in Brazil? Can they make money in India? And I know that from some of the colleagues here who are running corporations in South Africa, that's exactly what they do. But and I want to take away and dispel something about Nigeria, that, you know, I understand the tourism and all the rest of it that takes place, but there's a set of Nigerians who are running these businesses which they've built themselves, the UBAs, the Zeniths, the Access Banks. These people have built these businesses over the last 20 years. They're worth $500 million. They're worth $1 billion. They're not spending their time thinking about South Africa. I want to just really put that on the table. And at the same time, the oligarch class that exists here, the people who run Remgro, the people who run PSG, and their counterparts, they're also thinking globally. The issue is, how will the continent benefit from the interactions that take place? And it's a kind of falsehood to presuppose that Nigeria is this easy market where South Africans are going to go and operate in. It's not true, it's not real. So if you see declining profits, that's real. You might get there and make a mistake. I know many South African companies that have been to Nigeria and been burnt. And I know many South African companies that have been to Nigeria and made a lot of money. And so this is really business sense as to whether there's any kind of, at the business level, any special relationship.
I want to follow up with that question with this one. And please, I'm opening this up now so we can all participate. And the MEC's comment as well. That, you know, sometimes I think we can get too carried away, as you've just said, Professor, by virtue of being fellow Africans, and say on that basis, therefore, we're in agreement on how things should be, whereas we're motivated by different things. I'm just making the point. And then you look at the Southern African situation, South Africa being a leading economy here, would it not be in South Africa's interest at this time to integrate the Southern African region economies, Swaziland, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, that we concern ourselves with what's going on in Angola, for instance, and the DRC, where that if you grow that market, it's over 300 million people, right? And there are so many different dynamics that inform those economies. Then you build a much stronger economic region, and that the same applies in West Africa and the same applies Eastern Africa. That in due time, then, you can talk about a substantial African economy if you use that approach, instead of looking at who is bigger than whom, and therefore the two giants having to collaborate at some point, which may take much longer or may not even happen in the long run. I don't know what your views are with regards to that.
I think that is exactly the point. This is what has been happening. We remember we looked at SADC as a region itself, and then we clearly articulated a position that we should have East Africa and West Africa, and that all of these regions must in themselves, because of proximity and also the questions of language and other related reasons, to cooperate. And then we use the African Union as the central point just for measurement purposes. There are certain activities which cannot then be left to these regions. For instance, your political stability related issues, issues of wars, stealing of presidencies. Those are then issues that we take to the center. Remember, we took a decision to have the Maputo corridor. We are linking that Maputo corridor right now directly up to Zimbabwe. So these are routes that we have taken a decision for the stabilization of SADC as a region itself. So we have taken that decision. But you must understand the reason why even DR Congo is part of SADC. DR Congo has been trading primarily with France. To go to France they take much longer compared to coming to South Africa. It's 3 hours to come to South Africa. It's much longer going to France to engage economically with France. The only problem is your language barriers when it comes to ourselves, which is something that we are trying to correct so that we then are in a position to ensure that the entire SADC region grows on its own. Okay? And we have an obligation. You see, nobody will come from Europe. It doesn't matter where they are to trade in Africa. If there is no basic infrastructure, even Velasev wants to go to Malawi, for instance, to take food, they're using trucks.